And hello. Good afternoon for everyone over there in UK, EU. Just going to give it a minute here as we wait for folks to join into the room. Welcome to our Empowering Networks Operations Teams webinar for today. Just wait about 1 minute as we wait for the room to fill up, so just hang tight. Right. Great to see everybody joining in here for our UK EU edition. Welcome. We are going through our Automation Excellence webinar series. This is part 1, Empowering Network Operations Teams. Our agenda for today, we'll go through some introductions. Then we'll talk about excellence through intent, moving on to why the legacy approach falls short. Then value of network source of truth. What does that mean? And really, what is a network source of truth? Then intent-based networks in action, some practical applications of intent-based networks, and then some time for Q&A. If you do have questions, please do use the Q&A box down there in your Zoom bar. That is the best way to get us questions. That way we can make sure we address it and get you an answer, as well as share that question with the rest of the group so everyone can hear and get insight from whatever you may be wondering about. But please do feel free to interact with us. We'd love to get questions, so it's always good. We will either answer them live during the webinar or at the end during the Q&A session. So moving into introductions. My name is Tim Shryack. I am the Director of Sales Engineering here at Network to Code and happy to take you through the webinar today. And as a special bonus, as we are doing the UK-EU edition, also happy to introduce our Enterprise Sales Director in EMEA. Ben, why don't you say hello?
Hi, everyone. I hope you're well and having a decent sunshine out there in UK, Europe. Thank you.
Thanks, Ben. And Ben will be back with some questions as we go through as well. So moving on to excellence through intent, data is the foundation of network automation. And that's this first section here we're going to go through, which is what is the intended state? What do we mean by that when we say the intended state? The intended state of a network defines how the network should operate. And that definition is stored in our network source of truth. So typical things that we might contain in that network source of truth are our network policies, rules and configuration that govern the behavior and management of network traffic, our telemetry and monitoring policies, definitions used to configure monitoring telemetry systems, quality assurance requirements, the testing requirements that we might have, our security policies, the guidelines and rules that define how our network should be protected from unauthorized access, attacks, data breaches, etc. Compliance standards, business and government requirements that we have to implement or adhere to, ensuring that we meet our regulatory standards, design standards, performance requirements, business intent. All of these ideas that are expressed in how we actually form and operate our network are the things that we're looking at, and these are the ideas that we express into our network source of truth. The struggle we have is defining and delivering that intent in the traditional world. As we see here, you don't have to adjust your screen. That image is intentionally blurry because we're expressing this idea that intended state in our traditional managed environments is often kind of unclear and ambiguous. And what we really want to understand is, some of the things that we have is like neglected documentation. Intent must be constantly reviewed and updated. It's a reactive focus. That is, the pressures that we often are dealing with on our day-to-day basis end up meaning that we sideline our documentation or we just never get around to it. One of the ways I like to describe this is, one of the things that we know that network engineers love to do when they get up in the morning, the very first thing they think about is doing documentation. And we know that's not true, right? Like that's not how it works. It's usually the last thing we ever get to. And the result of this is that we have a lack of clarity. We have outdated information. We have inaccessible information or just plain up, straight up missing. And so these are the challenges we face as we operate our environments in these traditional ways. So intent-based operations resolve this problem. As engineers drive change into the network, the intent is what we update and change. And that is what instantiates change in our environment. So here's an example. A request is received to update, let's say, a monitoring policy. The engineer updates the telemetry and monitoring policy in our source of truth. The source of truth then implements and enacts that change in the network. So as we can see, we're really shifting the way the engineer does this work, because in the traditional world, what would normally happen is the engineer would receive this request, they would log into the equipment and immediately and directly make that change. Now, there may be some business process along that path where maybe they went and opened a ticket to document this change, or did some other types of business process steps, but there would be very little, if any, update into our source of truth or intended states. And so what we're seeing here is, rather than having the engineer interact with equipment directly, instead the engineer interacts with our intended state, our source of truth, and then automation delivers the rest from there. So this is really a shift in the way that we think about and manage our environments. The result is that documentation is done as part of our process, rather than something that needs to be done as an extra step. So enforcing the intended state of the network. The intended state can be used to automate any number of components, or basically all of the components that we see in our traditional world. So new device and rack site deployments, for example, our IT management system configuration, firewall policy, device lifecycle, all of the components that we're using can be informed and driven from this intended state. So as we look at a way that we make this practical, this is something that Network to Code has done to bring to the community and to the industry, is this idea of really instantiating a network source of truth. And that is, in practice, implemented via Nautobot, which is an open source project sponsored by Network to Code. At its core, it is a source of truth. It's a place where we can document and express what an environment should look like, typically containing things like our inventory management, so our devices and locations, our IPAM, our DCIM, all of the components we use to manage and operate the environment. So the network components like VLANs and ASNs, including up to how do I implement my business logic. That may be through custom relationships or custom fields that you might implement in the tool. So we can take the tool and actually really represent what you have in your environment. That's a key element of the project, is that we want it to be flexible so that it adapts to you rather than you trying to adapt to the tool. Now, on the other side, or the extension of that, is how do we then start to make that data useful? And that is the automation platform component of Nautobot. This is where we start to actually use the data we have in the source of truth to drive automation, to actually implement this idea of intent-based networking. A lot of this is implemented through Nautobot applications. You can see some examples here, things like our Golden Config app, for example, or our data validation app. These are all apps that take the data, make it useful, and actually allow us to begin to move into this idea of using our source of truth as a way that we drive in the environment. And one of the things I like to think about as we express this idea is this is allowing us to go from maintaining the letter of the law to actually implementing the spirit of the law. And what I mean by that is, quite commonly, as we think about our environments, for example, once a year, we usually come into our audit season, or maybe several times a year, depending on how many audits you are subject to in your environment. And we usually try to maintain our compliance such that we pass our audit. Essentially, we're trying to hit the letter of the law. Just let's make sure we can get through our audits, make sure we don't have any findings that we have to go remediate. That's not really the intent of compliance. The spirit of compliance is we want to operate good, clean, secure networks that deliver the services they should and protect us from outside attack and keep our network up and running 100% of the time, is our objective. That's the spirit of the law. And as we start to use intent-based networking in a tool like Nautobot, we can actually follow through on that ideal of hitting the spirit of the law rather than just maintaining compliance to the letter of the law. And that's really a key element here, is that we can truly level up the way we operate our environment by using a tool like Nautobot. Now, why does the legacy approach fall short? This is a really risky way to manage our networks. And these are things that we have dealt with over time as our networks have grown. First, we have the high cost of network management inertia. Essentially, there is actually a cost to doing nothing. And why does it matter that we should start to modernize and think about how we operate our networks? So we have kind of four major pillars here under this idea of doing nothing actually has a cost to it. First, it's difficult to scale. We have trouble scaling productivity. It means we have to increase our headcount in order to try to keep up. And therefore, our cost never decreases per activity, right? Like it's just only ever going to increase. We end up with unexpected and excessive downtime, either poorly planned and maintained network maintenances. Sometimes we have issues where there is downtime due to that's impacting our business reputation. In fact, Atlassian estimated that there's an average cost of downtime of about $7,400 per minute occurring in our environments across the industry every time we take an environment fails. We have delayed business initiatives. Our projects take longer than they are expected to, leading to delays or just failures of the project inevitably. We incur technical debt. And this is something that's been happening for decades in our networks. We keep kicking the can down the road and thinking we will deal with that someday into the future. We end up with excessively complex networks because we have inconsistent design, we have inconsistent configuration, we have unaddressed vulnerabilities. These all end up coming to impact us at some point. And we just pray and hope that it doesn't, right? But that is not a strategy. How does a legacy approach introduce risk? So not only is there a cost to it, but there's also risk. Almost all enterprise networks adhering to legacy practices exhibit at least some of these undesirable characteristics. We have things like outdated operating systems, non-standard based configuration. I look on one device and versus another where they should have virtually the same configuration and they don't match. We don't know about the state of our support contracts. We're paying for equipment that we don't need to have on our support contracts, for example, very common case. Poorly configured security, another really common one. We had an application, we sunset it 2 years ago, forgot to close the ports down on it. Now we have an open vulnerability into our network, into our environment. Think about your last major network outage. How quickly was your team able to determine the cause? How quickly was the solution determined? And how quickly did we implement it? And then afterwards, did we do root cause analysis, understand what happened, document that, and ensure that it won't happen again? It's really hard to maintain that in a production environment, particularly when you're doing it at scale by hand. And these are all ideals we're after, right? Like we want to be able to troubleshoot quickly, get to that root cause and understand it and make sure it doesn't happen again. But the reality is when we manage our networks through the legacy method, it's really hard to implement that. Now, why are these so cumbersome? Let's take a look at that. Like each step requiring access to different systems and then hoping the information there is correct. This is really common. We often will have multiple sources of truth in our environment, depending on what those sources may be. And quite often, they will not agree. So let's go through a simple example. An engineer gets a request, but to complete it, they have to spend quite a bit of time logging in and out of multiple systems. So the engineer receives the request and takes that from the ITSM system and notes there's some information from whoever requested it, put it in the ticket for what they need to implement. So the engineer starts to go gather information. And this is very common. They probably have to go look in multiple places. They're going to look in the CMDB to check the device that it exists and where is it located. They're going to look in the DCIM tool to see like, oh, what's the connectivity to that site? And then go check some information in IPAM. And then they may actually probably almost for sure log into the device itself to confirm that everything they just looked up is actually accurate. Because probably when they looked in one of those places, the information was inconsistent. And so they had to actually go out to the device to validate it was correct. Then finally, after all of that gathering, the engineers be ready to begin some implementation. So now the engineer is probably going to log again into multiple systems to begin the implementation phase. Then they start into the verification phase of going and checking, did everything just go correctly? And then finally, we hope they get to the documentation phase. But most likely, reality sets in. It's the end of the day. There's another ticket to work on. There's an outage. There's another project they were trying to get done that's got a deadline, and they never quite get down to step 5 and do the documentation like they were supposed to. This is just the reality of what happens in the real world. And we spend so much time collecting data, context switching. It's not surprising that it takes a really long time to get a simple task done. And this happens dozens of times a day for every single person operating in the environment, right? This is just typical what we see in most legacy environments. And these challenges are just compounding. They're not going to get better. We have this graph here. We see this general trend where beginning way back in the 90s, we had millions of devices, and we are headed towards billions of devices. Right now, we're just kind of above a billion, but this trajectory is growing at a crazy rate. And we expect to see just this exponential growth within our environment, within our networks, and the amount of devices that we are expected to maintain and that we have to operate. On top of that, we have a challenge of just hiring more people. Not only is that a challenge in and of itself, we also have this problem where there just aren't enough people entering our space. The workforce is not increasing at the rate that it would need to if we continue to operate our environments the way we do. As you can see here, some examples from the US Bureau of Labor, where the growth of the workforce is not matching the growth of the devices we're expected to manage. On top of that, new technologies constantly coming. Some examples here, we started off with routers and switches. We added in voice over IP, then Wi-Fi, and now we have additional complexities, SDN, virtual networking, as we move into cloud and hybrid cloud. And there's just yet more coming, right? This is not going to decrease. This is only going to increase. So after those challenges, what can we do? This is the value of a network source of truth. It is the most essential component of intent-based networking. It is the foundation. You cannot do infrastructure as code or intent-based networking or net DevOps, however you want to phrase it, without an accurate network source of truth. This is where Nautabot comes in. Unlocking cost efficiency with Nautabot's intent-based approach. It allows you to optimize your resource allocation, minimizing downtime. We're going to centralize data. We're going to streamline the data management process. We facilitate workflow automation, and we streamline automation development. These are key elements of what Nautabot brings to the table and what it enables your teams to do. We can also use Nautabot to mitigate network risks. It allows us to standardize and automate, therefore eliminating human error and providing better oversight. We have increased reliability, reliable and predictable networks, because we have defined our standards and we're able to enforce those standards. We can avoid outages caused by misconfigurations. Compliance is maintained through regularly checking and ensuring the devices are configured as expected. We enhance our security posture. We can eliminate human error and prevent new vulnerabilities with programmatic task execution. We can address vulnerabilities because we're able to go out and do things like automated operating system upgrades to patch our equipment at a rapid rate. We can apply configuration patches as well, depending on what the cause of that vulnerability may be. We have increased visibility. Because we have defined that intent, we can simplify the consumption of that information and allow the humans to make decisions more easily by just looking in one central place. We can then therefore eliminate a lot of that human error that happens because we have to go look at multiple sources. All of this leading to enhanced disaster preparedness. Configurations and topologies can easily be recreated from that source of truth in the event of a disaster or the need to move to our DR site. We can also get benefit from being able to perform vendor-neutral equipment swaps. So perhaps, we're currently using vendor A and we want to switch to vendor B. We get a better discount or what have you from a different vendor. We can do that more easily because we understand how our network is configured in a vendor-neutral fashion. Just an interesting quote here from Gartner. 80% of outages impacting mission-critical services will be caused by people and process issues, and more than 50% of those will be caused by change configuration, release intent integration, and handoff issues. So we have a significant impact coming from the way that we manage our networks in a legacy fashion, and this can be addressed as we move to intent-based networking. Notabot also provides us holistic perspective into our environment. This is something we alluded to on one of those earlier slides, where we have all of these different sources of truth. So whether it's our CMDB or our DCIM, IPAN, traditional sources of truth, but then other things that have now become sources of truth, things like ACI or our cloud controllers that we start to treat as sources of truth. And in the traditional world, we're asking the engineer to swivel chair between all of those different sources and make sure they're all accurate, which they probably aren't. So what we're doing with Notabot is bringing all of that information into one centralized location. It essentially becomes our data clearinghouse, where we can normalize that data, we can enrich it, we can synchronize it across our environment. So we can make sure that all of our sources of truth are accurate, up to date, and in sync with each other. And this is one of the great advantages Notabot brings to us. You can also see this example here on the screen where we can see all of this data in one place. You can see that represented by those colored boxes around each of the different components of data. So referencing whether it's from the device or from our DSIM tool or our CMDB tool, all of that data presented in one holistic screen for the human to consume. Now, down to Notabot, addressing decades of accumulated technical debt. We also referenced this on an earlier screen, this idea of this technical debt that we have acquired over the last 30 years that we've been operating networks. We have our legacy systems that we have just grown up with, and those have incurred various bits of technical debt as well. We acquire new companies, we merge with others, and all of a sudden we have all of these networks that are really difficult to maintain just because they're legacy. Along the way, we implemented temporary fixes that became permanent. This always happens. We always promise ourselves next year, next month, whatever it is, we're going to go fix this. And we never just really have the time. Therefore, leading to documentation gaps that just inevitably happen in our environment. And we have this impact of increased cost, reduced efficiency, innovation roadblocks. What Notabot allows us to do is to begin to address this problem in a consumable way. We can begin to take this bit by bit and solve these challenges as we move from our traditional method to our intent-based networking. And that is really one of the core elements of Notabot, is to take a practical approach to this idea. We understand you cannot just turn your network off and go rebuild it. So what we need to be able to do is essentially rebuild the plane while we're flying it. And that's exactly what Notabot enables us to do. Notabot is at the core of automated operations, and we're using data to drive that automation. That is empowered largely by the application ecosystem that we referenced earlier as well. And we're able to not only take advantage of the apps that are available as part of the open source project, we can also implement custom or extensions as needed into an environment. And that can be done either directly by your team or through an engagement with Network to Code, where we understand you are going to have unique business process in your world, and we need to be able to address that. So we can simplify your workflows via using Notabot applications, Notabot jobs, in which we can do things like, let's say, configure a VLAN and create a simple, repeatable process for your operations teams to follow. So let's take a look at some examples of intent-based networks in action. We're going to look at 3 here, and we'll go through these particular use cases that we have actually done with our clients. So this one is a pretty large convenience store chain and over 900 locations, and they had a challenge with how do they refresh their hardware. A lot of this had to do with the upgrade of the operating systems, as well as the hardware itself, perhaps planning for end of sale, end of life equipment. And before that, they were spending around 3,600 hours per instance of needing to do upgrades. And through the automation, we were able to significantly reduce that down to around 225 hours. So drastic change in the amount of time required in order to implement this kind of upgrade in their environment. What was this comprised of? Nautiba as the network source of truth, and then those applications where we are able to automate task execution, data collection, and validation. Benefits coming out of this, we have predictable workflow execution. Each individual upgrade follows the same process every single time, and tasks are completed with very few, if any, errors because we're making sure we're doing pre and post checks. So we're catching those things as it happens and making sure we deal with those problems that may occur during the upgrade process. Because this is also happening in an automated fashion, we're able to, and it has reduced its complexity, we're not able to use non-technical personnel to actually implement these upgrades. So now engineers are freed up to focus on other tasks. This idea of we need to be able to handle more with the same amount of people that we already have. So let's find ways that we can use automation to delegate what is currently a very high-level task down to lower-level or non-technical individuals. Here's another example. A major bank accelerating time to value. Automations streamlined tedious legacy practices. So here in this case, Nautiba was introduced as the network source of truth and became the single source of truth in the environment. That is, we leveraged the single source of truth application from Nautiba to collect and distribute data across their various existing sources. So that's DSIM, IPAM, their monitoring platform, all of their existing sources of truth centralized via Nautiba. What the benefits we see from this, right? Now we have one place we can go to find information, no matter who the team is. Individuals no longer have to log into multiple systems to discover the information they need in order to get their task or their job done. And automations are the same, right? Automations only have a single API to go request information from. So now complexity of developing internal applications is drastically simplified. The source of truth also gives you the capability to enrich and standardize this data that we're bringing in and synchronizing across the environment. So as data enters Nautiba, it is validated and normalized. So we're making sure that naming conventions are consistent, for example. We can ensure that all of our components and all of the data looks the same everywhere. Data is then automatically converted into this standardized format as we store it into the source of truth. Therefore, as we synchronize that data back out, now we have this standardized environment as well. We're now able to also take advantage of understanding what really exists in the environment. One of the great benefits they saw was this ability to forecast their device life cycles. They were able to see across over hundreds of thousands of devices that they had in their environment, when do I need to refresh things? So this is a very large scale environment, so managing that was difficult for them. Now we take a big benefit here where we're able to forecast. So we can look at in budgeting for next year and the year after what we expect to have to do for our end of support, end of life devices. This also means we spend less time collecting that information. We don't have to send folks to go do that by hand. We can do it through the automation, understand that, report on it, and take benefit from being able to simplify our world. Here's our last example coming from the US Department of Defense Joint Communications Unit using Nautiba to streamline their site deployments. So it's a really interesting use case talk that was presented at a conference where we're able to use Nautiba at its core to drive this type of deployment. Again, using Nautiba as that source of truth, using automation from Nautiba to create site topologies, express what intended sites should look like through design accommodations within Nautiba, and then have a capability for users or customers to access a self-service portal in which they can then deploy these types of sites. Prior to this, The creating topologies and deploying sites, very manual. Automation really drastically reduced both the expression of this intent and then the rendering of that configuration for these sites and then the deployment of that information. In this particular example, they were also leveraging Ansible AWX, the orchestration platform. That is the open source version of Ansible automation platform. And we're able to simplify the use of that tool. That tool typically needs its own inventory, right? So now instead of having to manually update that automation tool, we're able to render that from Notabot directly. So again, simplifying the platform, making sure we have consistent data across the environment. And then these standardized device configurations enabled the JCU to quickly perform device type lifecycle changes as well with Notabot jobs. So not only the benefit of deployment, but also those day two operations, those changes that are occurring, now also simplified as well. So much major benefit as we look across this type of implementation of intent-based networking. And 3 examples there for you from real-world projects that we have seen with our clients. So let's take a look at some practical applications of intent-based networking, essentially a better approach to managing our networks. What are some of those benefits? Example 1, reduced OpEx, finding unused circuits within Notabot. This is a common case we've seen. We've done this for a few of our clients where they have a large number of circuits. And it is inevitable when you manage a lot of circuits that there are probably some that should have been turned off or disconnected that are not. By using a tool like Notabot, we're able to now inventory the circuits we have through automation. We can go discover those circuits that exist on all of our routers and switches. We can bring those into the source of truth, and then we can generate a report that is comparing what we have in the database of Notabot up against what we're getting from our vendors. Then we can understand, here's a bunch of circuits that we don't need anymore. We can go ahead and retire. We can look for those ones that are just not in use, but we can also do things like we can look for underutilized circuits. We can take a look and pull in data from bandwidth consumption from our monitoring tool and understand like, oh, this circuit actually could be consolidated with another because it's barely being used, for example. Or perhaps we want to switch it from a more expensive type circuit to a less expensive type. We're able to understand that and see that information, report that information back based on the data that we have at the source of truth. We're able to fulfill customer requests more quickly. As we look at the existing way we do this, right? We went through some examples of this earlier, but let's take a little more detail on that. So here in our existing network management, each transition in tasks waits upon the next individual to act. And this accumulation of delay is measured across the entire process. So the customer or the user submits an order, request for something. An engineer reviews that request and sends out emails for approval. We then wait for our approval review, our risk management, or maybe our change board. We finally end up in front of the InfoSec approval review. Perhaps there was some issue with the request. We then finally move into performing that change and then QA testing and then close out the ticket. And as we move through that process, there's a large number of human interaction, potential for human error. Tickets are updated by hand, which means it's unpredictable. Quite often, that means we don't always update it exactly as we should have. So we have an unreliable historical record. Due to all of those additional manual oversights, that may trigger the process to start over. We have additional cost and delay, rather than being able to handle our standard changes through automation, where we know that the change is going to operate consistently. So as we look at modern network management, we follow the same business process. That is, we make sure that we do all of the tasks that we're required to by the business or our compliance, but we do it in a much more efficient way. So now the customer submits the order. We can qualify the request on submission through the automation. We can potentially provide a pre-approval where we understand this type of request falls within our whitelisted change, and therefore we said we don't need to go get individual approvals. This has already been pre-approved. We can move right on through the process. We can ensure that it's going to be compliant with all of our standards. We can perform the implementation and the testing after the implementation to actually verify the change went correctly. and then close out the ticket and notify the user that their change has been implemented. And we can go from taking days to implement requests to minutes, where a user can get the thing they need and carry on with operating the business as quickly and efficiently as possible. We can reduce our risks by ensuring every device configuration meets our standards. So let's talk through this a bit. We alluded to it earlier, but let's actually talk through this use case of using Naudibot as a way to implement our configuration compliance. Configurations are monitored to verify their compliance via Naudibot. So we express what the configuration should look like in the source of truth, and then we use the Naudibot automation platform to then go verify, is the device actually matching our intended state? If it's not, our administrators, our operators can be notified automatically that there is a problem, that somehow a device is deviated from the expected standard. And now we can go remediate that either by hand or even potentially through automation if desired. Now, when we first look at this, particularly for network engineers, can be somewhat of a scary thing. We think we do not want automation going and making changes automatically to our equipment. We're afraid of that. But if you take a minute and a step back, our companions over on the system administration side or the storage administration side, they have been doing this for decades now, where their configuration of their devices is handled purely through automation. And in fact, if you log into a system in your environment, almost for sure, and you look in a configuration file, it is going to say at the top of that configuration file, if you make a change here, it is going to be overwritten by the automation. Now, if they were able to do it, so can we. Now, our challenges are greater. We have more data to manage. Our environments are more complex in the hardware that we manage and operate, but that doesn't mean we can't reach this goal. And this is how we move from this idea of just implementing the letter of the law to actually being able to operate at the spirit of the law. That is, we want to have less frequent outages, shorter outages, less time spent troubleshooting, a more secure network. That is never going to happen if we don't change the way we operate our networks. Continuing the behavior that we currently do and expecting different results is not going to happen, right? We need to change how we operate and manage our environments. And this is the way. This has already been proven out in other silos within our tech stack. And we are simply taking those ideas and making them possible in a network environment. And that's what a network source of truth is all about. Streamlining our operating system upgrades. Here's a great practical example of something that is a common challenge, something that is really difficult, especially in a multi-vendor environment. As we look at this, it may be that we have a tool from a particular vendor that enables us to automate our operating systems upgrades. But as we operate in a multi-vendor environment, as our devices increase, this becomes harder and harder. And this is a major advantage of Naudibot, where we're able to implement our OS upgrades in a vendor-neutral way. So it doesn't matter if it's Cisco, Arista, Juniper, F5, name the tool or the vendor. We're able to manage all of those upgrades from one centralized tool. We're able to express what are our upgrade requirements, what are our pre-change quality assurance tests, what is our business process for the way we do upgrades. And then what do we want to confirm after that change? What is our business? What is our unique environment in our tech stack? Making sure we document that change and then update all the appropriate management systems as a result of that. This is what the Naudibot OS upgrade application enables us to do. Enables us to say, hey, rather than we hear there's a vulnerability from the security team and we need to go patch several thousand devices or whatever the case may be, and we think, oh, this is going to take us at least a quarter to do, maybe more in the traditional world. Now, this is something we can plan for and implement in a much shorter period of time, perhaps a month or even less, that we might be able to implement and scale now our environment and our management of that environment. All right. So that is bringing us to the conclusion of our prepared talks here. So let's start taking a look at any questions that you may have entered as we're chatting away here throughout this presentation. And then I know that Ben had a really interesting case that came up with one of his clients the other day that we also kind of wanted to talk through with you all and look at what that sort of question may have been and then kind of discuss the answer there. So Ben, let's go ahead with that first one that you had from your client.
Absolutely. So the question was that intent-based journey you mentioned during the presentation sounds interesting. Granted, I've seen the presentation before, sorry. But what kind of wins can we realistically expect in the first few months after adopting Nautobot? So what they're really asking to me is, are there some quick wins that they can grab a hold of and then demonstrate value?
Right. Yeah, this is a common question that we get, which is how do I know that going through this process, I'm going to show value back to the business, that I'm going to get benefit from this? What's the ROI, essentially, is really what we're asking. Uh, and the very first thing that we commonly see that really begins to benefit the teams is this idea of getting a centralized source of truth and getting that data in. So as we begin engagements with clients, the very first thing we typically do is implementation of Nautobot and then ingestion of data into Nautobot. And during that process, we are both getting a consistent environment, understanding what exists out there, as well as normalizing all of that data. So we're getting good, clean data into the source of truth. But we don't want to stop there because it is hard to prove real value, real ROI back to the business just from getting a good, clean source of truth. We want to actually start to use that source of truth. And there's beyond just the requirement for, hey, we want to show value, there's also the, how are we going to make sure we keep that data clean and accurate? And the best way to do that is to get engineers on board with this idea that data is not just about documentation, data is about how we actually drive change. And so from there, the most common tool that we see folks implementing beyond that in that first step is the Nautobot Golden Configuration app. That is Nautobot's method by which you can enforce config compliance. This allows us to begin this journey to understand where are the deviations in the network and how do we get good, consistent configuration in the environment. So first we get good, clean data into the source of truth, and then we begin to use that data to inform our intent and get the network actually clean and consistent. And that's where we start to see real value back to the business. Suddenly, we're able to implement change more quickly because the environment is consistent. We're also able to discover things that we no longer need to, say, go purchase. For example, we had a client where they discovered through the use of the Golden Config app and Nautobot as a source of truth that they had thousands of transceivers in closets they weren't aware of that they didn't need to go buy. And it freed up a bunch of money in their budget. So really great example coming in there as well. So this is the value we see in those first initial stages as we start to use Nautobot as our source of truth. We got a question in from the audience here as well. So let's see. Does Nautobot allow integration to open source AI tools? Maybe human language interaction. Would it be possible to query Nautobot instead of the traditional way of clicking through the page on the UI? Great question. This is coming up continually as we move into AI and large language models. The short answer is yes. I will give you a little explanation there as to what we mean by that. So all of the data that we have in Nautobot is accessible via the UI, of course, that's for human consumption, but it's also accessible via our REST API. That's where we can get individual pieces of information back, but we also have a GraphQL endpoint. And that is how we're able to get data in and out of Nautobot quite easily. Now, we have created integrations with several language models. I know off the top of my head of Big Panda and Moogsoft that we have used, but those are definitely not limitations. It's absolutely possible to use AI and language models in order to query Nautobot, find information, and be able to consume that information in a more friendly, human-readable fashion. So absolutely. This is something we are very much working on as well internally, and we hope to be able to release some exciting new features here coming up shortly as we move forward into a world where we are integrating AI into all the tools that we're consuming and using. So thanks for that question there. Let's see, Ben, did we get any other questions in while I was answering
We
that
did.
one?
So it's funny you should ask that, Tim. So our team's documentation might not be perfect. Not everything is programmer friendly. Is that a common hurdle when getting started with Nautobot? Are there ways to work around it or get the documentation up to speed in parallel with using the tool?
Right. So how do I get first of all that data ingested? How do I understand what my environment looks like? How do I begin to express that intent? Uh, we take two different abstraction levels here as it comes to data and then to intent. The first is the data itself, of course. How do I ingest that? Now, commonly what we're seeing and what we're using is the device onboarding tool that is part of the Notabot application ecosystem to be able to go scan our environment, discover all the data that exists out there. So we don't need to do that by hand. We definitely don't want to be entering data into Notabot by hand. That's not a good practice. So we have that step. Now from there is how do we express intent? As we move in, especially in a multi-vendor strategy, or even within a single vendor, perhaps you have different flavors of operating system, like from Cisco, for example. Maybe you have NXOS and iOS and iOS XE and XR, et cetera. How do I manage all of that? And that is handled through templatization so that we can express what our intent for the network is in a vendor neutral fashion. It doesn't matter whether it's Cisco, NXOS, or Arista, or Juniper, or even iOS, right? We express in a vendor neutral fashion, and then we're able to interpolate that into the vendor syntax required. So this is how we deal with this problem of ingesting data, making sure we can get started somewhere. And this is one of the major benefits of engagement with network to code is that we're able to accelerate this journey for you. We add that force multiplier that we're able to get you moving more quickly to show value both to the business and the technical team. Because if we take too long, we're just never really going to get there on that journey because there is not value coming back quickly enough. I think it looks like we also have another question coming in here. Is it possible to have a test account? Oh, great question. So Notabot is available as a free and open source. You could download it today and try it out. There is a Helm chart if you wanted to try it out in a Docker on your laptop, or you can spin up a VM. But even better than that, Notabot is available in the Notabot cloud. So you don't have to go do anything other than get an account from Network to Code. So absolutely, we can definitely get you a test account to try it out in Notabot Cloud. You will just need to reach out to us through our sales team. Coming up here at the end, we'll have a few slides. You'll be able to reach out to Ben or get that arranged. We'll get you his contact information, so don't worry. So yes is the short answer. You can absolutely get a test account, try it out. Okay. Looks like, I think that looks like all the questions we've had coming in. Thank you everyone for the questions you've been asking and following through on those. Always great to hear interaction back from the group. Let's just move on as we move into the conclusion of the webinar here. A few things. We do have training available. This is a common question we get as well, which is how do I level up my team to be able to transition from this traditional world into intent-based networking? One of the major aspects of our business beyond helping clients move more quickly is training your teams. We have a combination of instructor-led training along with online training available. The best world is the hybrid of those two things, where teams are able to go into a boot camp, spend a day or a few days in a class, really get practical hands-on information from a trainer, go through those labs as well, where they have live feedback from their instructor, but then follow that up with that online training. So as they have questions, as they move through their work life, they can go and reference that information back. They can continue to practice and actually implement this work in their day-to-day life. As you see across the training spectrum there, we're starting off from just getting started all the way up through very advanced topics such as telemetry monitoring and analytics. So lots of opportunity here to learn and really level up your team. As we looked at what we talked about today, we learned how intent-based networking in Notabot delivers outstanding outcomes that make your organization more productive and reduce operational risk, along with a few real-world examples and practical examples of intent-based networking in action. We talked about achieving excellence with intent-based networking, legacy approach, shortcomings, some practical applications, and then outcomes that a network source of truth delivers. We also just recently released a network automation maturity assessment. If you're wondering, hey, where am I compared to where I want to be? This is not too many questions. It's about 35 questions. It takes about 10 minutes to complete. And what it's going to do is help you understand where you are, identify where you want to go, and then give you some elemental ideas of how you can proceed from the current state to the future state. It's a very great automated report that will be generated for you, but specific to your environment based on the answers that you provide, and is a great way to begin to understand how you can proceed from where you are and where you might like to go. Thank you all for attending. Here are a few links to everything all Notabot related. Great QR code there for you to get some basic information, as well as Ben's contact info. Please do reach out to him if you'd like to set up a demo, have a one-on-one conversation with us, or get access to Notabot Cloud so you can try it out. Thanks, everyone, and look forward to seeing you on the next webinar.